Well, welcome everyone. Hi, my name's Brett Mills and I'm really pleased to be chairing this session, the first panel of this SLO conference. So thanks to Elke and everyone else who's been involved in the organisation of this. And so this panel, which is on TV studies and criticism in the age of multi-platform television. So we have three speakers in the panel, papers, shouldn't go over 20 minutes, please, speakers. So that'll give us some time, a good amount of time at the end for discussion. Everyone who's attending, as Elke's just said, but for those who've just come in, cameras and microphones off during the presentations if you can. At the end for the Q&A, if you're able and willing to put your camera back on, that could be quite useful, especially if you're asking a question. It's nice for the speakers to see some faces rather than speaking to a load of black boxes. And the chat box is there, so of course you can put questions in there, but also comments throughout the whole thing. You're very welcome to do that. So our first speaker today is Robert Watts. He's told me he's happy to go by Rob, so I'm going to say Rob Watts instead, who's independent scholar, and his talk is on the big picture, considering the impact of binge watching on popular TV criticism. I'll pass over to you, Rob.
Great, I will just check again that my slides are working. Someone can let me know if that's in full screen.
Yep, that's fine.
Brilliant, thanks Brett. And thanks to Elke and the team for organising such an accessible conference under the circumstances. I'm really looking forward to the next couple of weeks. So my paper today is going to be focusing on popular TV criticism. So reviews, previews, columns, and critical recaps both in print and online. And look at some of the ways in which TV criticism, particularly in relation to drama, has been impacted by the shift towards binge watching over the past several years, and specifically the all episodes at once model that's been popularized by Netflix. So I'll talk a little bit about how variable a form TV criticism has been historically. But the key argument as far as the present context is that Netflix's encouragement of binge watching as a consumption norm lends itself to these singular series reviews from TV critics, what I'm calling here the big picture reviews, that take the complete season rather than the individual episode as the main object of criticism. So such reviews, I'm going to argue, tend to draw more upon the evaluative aesthetics of film criticism as a mode that considers works as unified wholes. So critics speaking from a position of access to the complete text, providing reviews or previews for this imagined consumer spectator who isn't necessarily grounded in any particular national context. So we can contrast this big picture mode with earlier critical traditions organised around segmented and serialised episodes, approached as more open texts, programmes part of a specific broadcast flow, reviewed for an imagined national television audience watching along with the critic. So hopefully this, oh, there we go. Sorry, I've moved on too much. The bulk of this paper draws from a chapter written for this forthcoming collection on binge watching and contemporary television studies, edited by Reco Jenner. The chapter in there is focused specifically on this tension between programmes developed within a national television culture and the transnational market in which they increasingly now operate. So it looks at the role of critics in framing points of national and local specificity through these kind of big picture singular reviews. The case study I'll be using builds off a transnational reception study from my PhD thesis that looks at the BBC dramas Happy Valley and The Fall, both shows with very distinct cultural references, initially produced for a weekly domestic audience in mind, but both of which were reframed in their US reception as these highly bingeable Netflix originals. So I argue that the singular review frame, or the big picture, tends to suppress or simplify local or nationally specific details. And in that sense, it can ease the text's transnational assimilation, the critic here functioning as a kind of tour guide for the prospective viewer, shaping, framing their experience of any potentially obtrusive difference by using this idea of bingeability to suggest it's a world, an experience worth immersing yourself in. So while this particular case study I'm using today is quite narrow in scope, looking only at contemporary crime drama, only at transnational flows between the US and the UK, what I want to suggest is that popular TV criticism in the way it responds to industrial shifts, like the rise of binge watching, might have impacts and functions that are still relatively underexplored. And Paul Rickson, in his own extensive work on criticism, has argued this. The discourse and function of popular TV critics is still relatively under-researched as an area within television studies. So I'm kind of hoping to build on Rickson's own framework here today with this idea of the big picture review as a critical mode of the streaming era. So before I get to my own case study, there's just a couple of relevant contexts to establish, I think. First, this shift towards the singular series review doesn't simply emerge with Netflix. It's very much bound up in the earlier discourses about quality TV. So if we go back to the very first issue of Critical Studies in Television in 2006 here, you see Mark Lawson calling for an end to the traditional generalist mode of the next day television review, where the viewer and the critic were assumed to be in this dialogue around a shared moment in the broadcast flow. Lawson claimed this didn't align with modern consumption trends, at least in terms of drama, and argued that box sets afforded these texts an afterlife equivalent to that of cinema and literature, and that reviews ought to be a lengthy consideration of the season as an event that the reader might decide to experience for themselves. And similarly, Rickson, in his own work, draws a connection between the quality TV discourse of that early HBO era to this more aesthetically oriented neo-serious critical mode, as he describes it, that tends to focus on the text divorced from the televisual flow. In doing so, it kind of ends up leaning into these long-standing notions of high legitimate culture, such as the lauding of an all-powerful author figure. So before streaming even emerges, there's this sense of the season becoming the event of television, at least that is within the culturally privileged drama genre. The discourse, I think, of the bingeability has to some extent stepped into the space held by earlier euphemisms of quality like cinematic or novelistic, performing a similar legitimating function that ultimately seeks to establish this distance or difference from regular broadcast TV. The second important context I think we should note is there's something of a pushback on all this in the past year or so, as these new entrants into the so-called streaming wars seek to build up their audience by reverting back to some degree of weekly scheduled appointment viewing. What's framed here as a choice between binge and burn or weekly pulse distribution, which seems a kind of fancy way of saying scheduled episodes. Within the trade discourse around this, there seems to be like a slightly nostalgic sense among critics and producers that there was a lot of value in sustaining a weekly conversation with audiences. And it's also obviously been very effective for Disney in sustaining this media buzz around releases like WandaVision, Loki, Mandalorian. This clipping at the bottom here, it actually is something I saw the other day from a critic who writes these singular big picture reviews, suggesting the weekly rollouts and the in-progress coverage and buzz they generate of these new streamers is actually valuable in sifting out these series that are going to be worth investing your binge quota in as a critic to commit to covering in this way. So while there's a tangible sense something might be lost in our experience of TV by privileging binge watching as the norm, there's also this sense it's not simply a one-directional trend. There's very much a push and pull still between scheduled episodic and all-at-once distribution in the streaming age. Critics are having to adjust their approaches accordingly. And that's really to my point here at the bottom about TV criticism's fluidity being worth studying. Scholars like Rickson and Mike Poole have noted TV criticism as a historically variable discourse, shifting its form and address along with changes in technology, access, and assumptions about TV's cultural status. So yeah, it's bound up in all these ideas about convergence between film and TV cultures, gatekeeping over ideas of quality and legitimacy, but I think within that, there's certainly dynamics worth looking at more closely. So to do that, I'll move on to my own case studies here, Happy Valley and The Fall, which are both examples of what Karen Petrushka and Faye Woods have termed false originals, so finished or canned programs, both of which had already proved very popular with domestic audiences, and were the subject of much ongoing week-to-week attention from TV critics and journalists before being acquired by Netflix, who essentially kind of decontextualized them from their BBC origins for the US market. Happy Valley, I've talked about before, is particularly an interesting example, I think, in that its appeal outside of the UK context has been framed as almost accidental. Its producer, suggested she was surprised with the acclaim for the show. It felt quite local and specific, wasn't made with an international audience in mind. And if you haven't seen the show, it's a crime drama whose mode of address does seem to assume a national or local audience. It's saturated in these names of West Yorkshire villages and towns, regional dialect, idiom, specific cultural and topical references to issues like Hebden Bridge's heroin problem, often with little to no expositional translation of these details. The Fall, meanwhile, is a serial killer drama set in post-Troubles Belfast. And like Happy Valley, it shoots on location, flags the specificity of its regional setting visually and through dialogue, casting and cultural referencing. And both series offer several points of contrast with what US critics have historically associated with British imports. So the PBS mystery and heritage strands, for example. Both deal with contemporary social problems in a northern locale and don't go to great lengths to translate those cultural references for non-native audiences. So to examine how these national elements were appraised in both the domestic and the US context, I analysed reviews of the first 2 seasons of both series across both national contexts. And for the US Netflix release, both series were almost exclusively reviewed for prospective viewers in this big picture mode that I'm talking about today, with the critic evaluating the season as a complete text, as with a film review, while the domestic critical reception in the UK and Ireland was far more varied across the span of these series' broadcast runs. And taken together, it reads like a kind of ongoing in-progress commentary on these series as they unfolded during their run, with episodic reviews and previews in a dialogue with news items and editorials. So in the in-progress commentaries I've got on the left here, the critic and reader are assumed to be at a similar stage of access to the narrative. These reviews are typically more attentive to micro-level textual elements, plot points, subplots, character relationships and enigmas, specific pieces of dialogue and performance. And they're much more likely to connect these details to their social context, like drug abuse, sectarian tensions, or class politics. In terms of the value judgments, they tend to be praised on popular appeal, so how well they're sustaining the interest of their target audience as a broadcast drama, or discussed in the language of media effects or matters of public service and public interest, particularly when it comes to things like sex and violence. On the other hand, the big picture reviews tended to look at macro level elements and their overall aesthetic effects, the broader story arcs, their thematic resonance, the overall style, tone, and compulsiveness of the series, how bingeable a spectacle it is essentially, whether it succeeds aesthetically. The main intertexts for the big picture reviews are not social discourses, but comparisons with similar films, filmmakers, television series that give a sense of these texts' generic appeals and their aesthetic value. So just to give a kind of snapshot of how the in-progress critical dialogue can emphasize social context in a way that the big picture review tends not to. These are a few of the press responses to The Fall during its first broadcast run, some of which are episode reviews, some are kind of furious editorials. Most of the discussion around the series revolved around accusations that its highly aestheticized scenes of sexual violence and murder were misogynistic. And the Daily Mail called it depraved torture porn, paid for by the license fee and beamed into our homes. And the writer, Alan Cubitt, responded to critics in the press a few times in a kind of ongoing dialogue, arguing that the series was a critique of the patriarchy. It was widely acknowledged that the show was trying to draw some kind of symbolic contrast between gendered violence and political sectarian violence associated with Belfast during the Troubles. And the Troubles are referenced throughout the series. The critical discussion during the first series in the UK in progress coverage was largely in the form of a debate on whether the BBC as a public service broadcaster was handling these sensitive social issues realistically, appropriately, or exploitatively. The idea that the show was attempting to make a feminist statement is kind of taken for granted in the big picture US reviews, which use that position of hindsight on a complete text, more to assess whether this aestheticized violence succeeds or satisfies. So rather than being referential to the social context, these series are considered in terms of innovation and subversion of genre tropes, placing them in the discursive terms of US quality drama discourse. So rather than focusing on individual moments of violence, references to the Troubles, which are scarcely, if ever, mentioned in this series, the critics pick out recurring formal devices, such as the mirroring of scenes between these two leads, Gillian Anderson and Jamie Dornan, throughout the series. The fact that Belfast and the Troubles gets relatively little attention, despite the references to it and subplots throughout, shows how a big picture review can help in suppressing what John Corner has referred to as the referential axis of screen violence, where the viewer feels discomfort in how close that violence sits to their own social context. And it strengthens the big picture review, the poetic axis, where pleasure is taken in viewing violence within these established genre conventions, distanced from the social world. So that contrast between a socially situated referential axis and an aestheticized poetic axis, I think is also evident in the different responses to Happy Valley's representation of language and region. So its faithful rendering of West Yorkshire dialect and northern character was heavily emphasized in the ongoing coverage in the UK, the In Progress coverage, as part of this broader national discourse about regional representation in a London-centric media. These reviews, the episode reviews, tended to pick out subtleties of regional dialogue, humour and referencing that were largely missed in the big picture reviews in the US. And these big picture reviews did notice these cultural quirks. They are referred to, but they're framed in a much broader sweep, collapsing them into one overall aesthetic element of this strong sense of place, but also framing them as a challenge worth overcoming. The critic vouching that a certain amount of being lost in translation is part of the aesthetic experience here, part of its authenticity. So while the political and cultural referencing is largely ignored in reviews of The Fall as a singular text, it's seen as inconsequential to the viewer's enjoyment there. With Happy Valley, we see something else. We see a kind of cultural markup where untranslated elements are seen as these productive difficulties worth kind of grappling with as part of the overall experience. But what they actually mean, understanding them isn't necessarily necessary. They are a pleasure in themselves. These framings, I think, contribute to a general sense throughout the US big picture reception that these originals are for a more discerning or discriminating viewer. Both of those terms come up a lot in all of the singular reviews of Happy Valley, especially. But both series were frequently framed as niche discoveries for discerning viewers in search of a weekend binge. And that is something I get into a bit more detail in the chapter than I think I have time for here. But I suggest these kind of big picture reframings can be understood through reference to the tourist gaze and the way that binge distribution encourages approaching the whole text as a singular experience, akin not only to cinema, but also the tourist event as a kind of immersive or transportive spectacle. So John Urry has linked the ability to travel historically with displays of social status and details the various types of tourist gaze in his work that are built around expectations of a pleasurable difference. These expectations are framed by mediating agents such as tour guides in Urry's account, or in this case, the critic judging the relative importance of these differences to viewer enjoyment or to their own sense of cultural capital as consumers within the big picture assessment of this experience. And Amy Corbin, I'll skip the red foot there for time, but Amy Corbin in her work on the tourist gaze in film links the idea of absorption and immersion to touristic instincts. She suggests in tourism, you know, there is a definite starting and ending time, at which point you then return to your real world. And she compares this to cinema. But she also briefly suggests that binge watching might in fact offer an even greater level of immersion in this regard, which I think is what I'm trying to speak to here in terms of binge watching as potentially activating touristic instincts, and the critic as tour guide activating those in their assessments. So again, we're sort of in the realm of convergence, ideas of cinematic television that we're probably all kind of sick of to some degree. But rather than seeing those ideas as some quality inherent in the text itself, I think it's good to shift focus to the ways in which binge distribution and the singular big picture review that it encourages can suppress, I suppose, the sort of TV-ness of the text and generate all these other affects and discourses. So while I think this case study might be seen as speaking to a very specific industrial, historical, and generic context in its examples, I hope it illustrates there's still some value in examining the various forms of TV criticism and how they change alongside these shifts. The role of the critic, not just as a cultural gatekeeper, but as an active mediator of some of these wider processes that are happening. And that's it. Thank you.
Thanks, Rob. Thanks so much for that. A really great opener, and the discussion about the series versus the episode, I'm sure, is a set of debates that's going to ripple throughout this entire conference. So thank you. I look forward to the discussion later. Right, I'll now pass over to John Ellis from Royal Holloway, whose talk is The Streaming Disruptors Are Undermining TV Studies as well as Broadcast TV. So over to you, John.
Thank you very much, Brett. I hope I'm audible here. I'll start sharing screen, and there we are. So right, well, here's another title for the same paper. Give it all sorts of titles. It's very nice to follow Rob's piece, which is a good illustration of the kind of changes that are being wrought in our discipline, really without our knowing it. Because of course, you know, the streamers contain very little of, very few of television's traditional genres. One of the things I wonder about is how much we're losing sight of what used to be called ordinary TV. But now I'm talking about something else. This problem here. How can we plan our teaching if we don't know if programs will be available? How can we study TV history when the back catalogues of the streamers in particular are suddenly deleted or withdrawn? How can we create a common culture with our students when they don't have access to the multiple subscriptions that we do, or have access to completely different ones? And what's the point of audience studies when there are petabytes of audience data that we simply can't access because they are the trade secrets of the streaming giants? So these are the real problems that we face now in terms of television studies and how we move forward. And it's worth recalling the history of film and TV studies. It's a history of access, and it's a history also of getting your hands on the footage itself, getting your hands on stuff, having a physical copy. Because you can trace that film studies really began from the accelerated circulation of 16mm prints after 1945, and then the whole series of technological innovations which enable people to hold on to copies of copyright material: VHS cassettes, Laserdisc, DVD, Blu-ray, and then file sharing. Television studies, similarly, born from VHS recorders, enabling you at last to see again the live stream of television, broadcast television. And then there were the same box sets, PVRs and so on, in addition to Laserdiscs, cassettes. So in all these cases, the physical copies were controlled by the users. They were held in libraries, they were held in personal collections. And the multiple use, reuse, and even resale of these physical items was tolerated by copyright holders, even though they continued to put those Mickey Mouse copyright warnings on the front of particularly DVDs. Now, streaming has reversed all of that. Streaming is a massive copyright grab by the controllers, the original controllers of copyright. It reverses 40 years of the history of physical copies being controlled by users. Now the users are controlled by the highly conditional access that the services give them. Subscriptions give you no rights, give you no guarantees. Texts are controlled by the streamers, or at least access to the texts are controlled entirely by the streaming giants. We've moved backwards because of streaming in terms of what we can do with copyright material and how we can study it. And that's just texts. With broadcast audience research, and people are remarking on how little audience research is done nowadays within television studies. Well, there are reasons for this. Broadcasters share quite a lot of data, but even so, limited audience data to justify their advertising or their license fee revenue. You can buy detailed quantitative data as a researcher. You can buy it from market research organizations. You can buy it from Barb. Researchers can even participate in the Barb and other surveys by commissioning questions on those surveys. And qualitative data can be developed also from interviews, from notebooks, from observation. Well, that's how we used to do it. The streamers, of course, have got an utterly different data model. And Netflix in particular boasts that it is a data-driven corporation. Its business is only incidentally television material and a few movies. Its real core business is data. Back in 2017, when they were recruiting a lot of people, so publicized rather more than usual about what they were doing internally, they already had 2017 detailed data on user behavior of over 10 billion viewing hours per quarter. This generates over 500 terabytes of information each day. And so they have put a lot of work into managing that data. Unlike most organizations, they started from the ground up and designed an integrated data hub, which can be accessed by everybody working within Netflix for whatever they want to do with that data. And that processes 4 petabytes a day, or it did back in 2017. It'll be an order of magnitude greater than that now. Netflix finds patterns that we cannot see, are not visible to the naked eye or to us as kind of rather anecdotal researchers. Netflix finds patterns in every choice of content, every pause, and every rewind. But all of that data remains a business confidential secret, which is the most closely guarded secret in the organization. Now, these streaming companies are our enemies because they manage demand through scarcity and withdrawal. That has always been the business model of one of the new big streamers, Disney, and they will carry on doing that in their streaming service as well. The arbitrary withdrawal of useful features also happens. Things like My Collections come and go from different streaming services. And there is a lot of secrecy even around the data collection and use. Now, it's important to point out that these are entirely commercial decisions. There's no technological reason why this should be the case. This is not a specific affordance of the streaming platforms. None of this is. It is simply the way they choose to use that technology and the way they choose to structure their business. Now, of course, that means that there are other ways of doing things. So here is a charming little video, rather low budget, about something called Bob, which UK users, UK attendees at this conference will be well familiar with, but people outside will not.
Meet Bob, the on-demand service for education, brought to you by Learning on Screen, an organisation with almost 75 years in the sector. Bob provides users with access to an archive of over 2.5 million broadcasts and more than 75 free-to-air channels to record from, including BBC's 1 and 2 and their regional variations, BBC 4, ITV, Channel 4 and Film 4, and 10 foreign language channels, among them French, German and Italian. Fully accessible by staff and students, users also gain content from the BBC's RES project and Shakespeare archives, with broadcasts dating back to the 1950s, and our pre-1990s specialist academic collections grow larger all the time, with each and every episode of Play for Today, as well as Arena, already available. And that's not all. Bob also provides tools to make the content work for you. Create and share playlists, generate clips and clip compilations, search program transcripts and subtitles, embed content in VLEs, and enjoy one-click citations for hassle-free academic referencing. And there's more on the way. With the education space increasingly adopting more online approaches, we're hard at work on a host of new features designed to help where it's needed most.
They're still hard at work, unfortunately.
All informed by
Oh no,
consultations.
go away. Shut up. That's better. Now, Bob, you can see that that kind of presentation tells you the scale of the organization which is behind Bob. It may have, getting on for 3 million different television programs available now, but the entire organization consists of 16 people doing everything. It's enabled by, Bob is underpinned by a highly unusual piece of legislation that dates back to the 1988 UK Copyright Act, which created an education exception. They got worried about the fact that people in education were taping programs off the television to show to their classes, and this was technically illegal. So the education exception was provided for in the 1988 Copyright Act, allowing UK education to make and keep copies of television broadcasts in perpetuity. And on the basis of that, an organization called BOFEC, which is now called Learning on Screen, developed a VHS sharing service in 1990. If one place had a VHS, BOFEC would copy it for you if you needed it from another education institution. So it was an early form of collectivization. In 2011, a great leap forward took place. A streaming service, one of the early streaming services in 2011, called Boxer Broadcast, a subscription service for universities available to both staff and students, which would make available any chosen television broadcast in perpetuity to anyone who wanted to access it. And the beauty of Bob is it's crowdsourcing. Anyone can choose a program to be saved by Bob, and then it is available to all Bob users. And this crowdsource model has produced this archive of more than 2.5 million programs, which is now available to any user. And as you can see, there are a number of ways of using this, and particularly useful, I find, is the searching of subtitles, which enables you to find all sorts of content. In the near future, the kind of searching facility, which is one of the weak points of the current Bob service, is going to be radically overhauled by linking it up with a lot of other databases that Learning on Screen already has. So there is coming an integrated search function across Bob, which will be much better than what is now. I know this because, declaration of interest, I'm the chair of Learning on Screen. So what this tells us is streaming doesn't have to be like it is in Netflix, Disney, Amazon, and the rest. Bob uses the affordances of streaming to create access for study to this huge collection of third-party copyright material. It has the cooperation of UK broadcasters in this, and they get a share of the license fee paid by institutions. Streaming services could also provide study access to their collections, but they don't, except in the case of MUBI and various specialist organizations like that, which do have a certain back catalogue that's available to us. Equally, streaming services could provide research access to their user data, probably restricted access, but in just the same way as we have restricted access to the Barb audience survey data and even more restricted access to Nielsen data and so on. But they don't. They don't provide any decent data whatsoever. And for these two reasons, they are putting us out of business. They are making it impossible to carry on with television studies as we have done in the past. However, when Netflix wants to share, it does share. If you go to GitHub, you find a lot of the data processing software that Netflix uses shared as open source software. It also provides production companies within its network, its production partners as they're called. It provides software to them for use within production. So Netflix does share when it's in its interests to share. It shares its software, it shares these kind of things to eliminate problems in their production pipeline. It also wants to become industry standard. It wants other people to refer to its model, its way of working as the industry standard. It also wants to create a pool of potential workers who are already Netflix enabled, because Netflix does find it difficult sometimes to enculture people. So sharing of its software is one way of getting over that problem and finding people, finding talent out there. Now, my argument is that academic researchers and teachers should also become part of this sharing culture. We should be mounting a campaign to seek educational access to both the back catalogue of the streaming services and for limited access to their audience data, both so that we can continue to study, continue to teach, but also so that a lot of our graduates who are going to gravitate towards these organizations in future have really got the basic skills to be able to work for them. So I'm proposing a deal here, a two-way street, which would enable us to get proper access to back catalogue and data from the streaming services, which we currently do not have. So there, I think, having underrun, I leave it. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, John. It's great and a really innovative set of ideas, and thanks for underrunning as well. That gives us more time for discussion, so that's really useful. Brilliant, thank you. All right, I'll move to our next speaker then, which is Klara Fajkusova from Pulaski University, and her talk is Curricular Tracks, Television Studies in the Czech Republic. So I'll pass over to you.
Thank you, and thank you, Rob and John, for fascinating papers. I can't wait to discuss them afterwards. Just let me do quick screen sharing, and we are on. Okay, so television studies are often very Anglophone centric, and that can be very useful because English kind of functions as lingua franca in these days. So we can have this discourse that is shared by many people, not only from British or American academic landscapes, but often there are the countries and discourses that are outside of Anglophone countries are left out. So that is the reason why I want to present you what is actually happening with television studies in Czech Republic. a little bit of explanation of the title. It is actually taken from the conference that we held at my department. I helped co-organize it, and it was great to meet all other people who are dealing with television. It was actually television and radio studies conference, because we have television and the radio studies program at my department. And what you see is basically 2/3 of scholars dealing with television in our country. So first of all, the context, because it is quite different from American or British one. So Czech Republic, of course, is a post-socialist Eastern European country. We divided from socialist and Soviet influence after Velvet Revolution in 1989. So that means that a lot of ideas, a lot of discourses and academic fields and even television programs arrived quite late in Czech Republic in the 90s. For example, as there is a consensus between television scholars, TV studies were legitimized and institutionalized in the 90s. And during this era, we were just re-establishing film studies and media studies in our country. And these two fields are kind of predecessors to television studies. So we can imagine how late in the game we were. So, for example, to give you more examples to imagine how it looks here. Media studies, actually, at my university, which is the second oldest university in Czech Republic, were divided from journalism in 2009, and cultural studies came only a year later. And television and radio studies program that I mentioned, which is part of Department of Theatre and Film Studies, was established in 2017. And it is only theoretical program that is focused on television in Czech Republic. I will get soon more to the fact that there are also practical schools that teach television, but it is from different point of view. And there is a television institute set to start in 2022 in Brno, but it's expected to be also more practically focused on media practitioners. So we will see about that. And what is important to note here is that study of media is not usually encompassing both theory and practice as it might in foreign countries. In Czech Republic, there's a separation of theoretical and practical programs. So there are schools that teach media practice, like film school FAMU in Prague, which is great tradition, and you can study television there, but it's not really theoretical. And there is kind of skepticism and also even rivalry between theoretical and practical schools, because practical schools tend to view theoretical or theory-based programs as too theoretical. Sorry for tautology, but it's how it is. They often view us as too deeply invested in theory and not getting enough practice, and it's vice versa. Film schools are viewed as lacking in theory and as teaching theory in a shallow way. So there is this great divide between practical and theoretical schools, and it is also a reason why I'm mostly talking about theoretical programs today. So when it comes to study of television, of course, it didn't start in 2017. There has been writing about television since 60s, but there were mostly ideological manifestos or handbooks for media practitioners. And in the last 20 years or so, there's been a rising interest in study of television that began with individual scholars from media studies or film studies that started to write and teach television. And this overlaps with legitimization of television that is also currently happening. And as it was noted by Charles Branston, it's actually prerequisite for study of television to know that it is worth of study. So this overlap is working closely together. And legitimization of television is happening through writings in popular but also semi-academic magazines like Cineper 25 FPS, or industry programs and lectures at festivals like Summer Film School, and establishing of Serial Killer, which is a television Eastern European television festival that was established in 2018. There is also television think tank that is a platform for study of television that was established at my department at Polacky University. But it is important to note that this legitimization is actually focused on certain parts of television, and that is mostly quality TV and cinematic television. And it is because most people that write about television, especially as critics and not academics, they come from film studies, so they tend to view television through this approach, and it is kind of limiting because they often decide what is only interesting for them as only types of television that are worth of study. And this influence of media and film studies is nothing new. It is also part of history of television studies abroad, but there are some specificities in Czech Republic. So I want to focus on how television is studied at departments of media studies and film studies, and then to focus more closely on television studies itself. So while Jonathan Gray and Amanda Lotz wrote in their brilliant book about television studies in 2019 that it is advantageous for television to be considered as part of media studies and television studies are not synonymous in Czech Republic. Study of television within media studies often means to focus on, again, certain parts of television. Here it is factual television, so mostly topics of TV broadcasting, TV journalism, and TV news. The main topics are TV news production and reception, or ideological reading of these programs, and representation. And of course, methods are also derived from sociological approaches, such as content analysis or discourse analysis, theories of representation, reception analysis, etc., which often provides quite interesting studies, but it can be said that media studies teach all television. They teach only certain parts of television. And on the other hand, film studies are mostly dominated by a focus on TV fiction, and especially quality TV or complex TV or cinematic TV. Again, there are cultural hierarchies at play here. And it also stems from the fact that film studies are often centered in this cinephile approach, and film studies themselves can be quite elitist in their chosen subjects. So, for example, there's a notion that art house cinema or classical cinema is more worth of study than mainstream cinema or popular cinema. Of course, that is changing, but these kind of ideas are implied here. And it brings up the question of how to study television and how does that study of television participate in the legitimization of the medium? Because of course, study of television and establishing of TV studies within institutions is important part of legitimization. But the way television is studied also shows implied notions about television itself, how it is viewed, how it is actually considered in the not just academic minds, but also popular discourse. And study of television in film studies is mostly dominated by textual analysis, genre and narrative analysis, and other methods that are often derived from film studies and not TV studies. So television is studied by methods that were developed for film. So there are often misunderstandings of how television actually works, because even if we live in the era of convergence, film and television are still quite different. And some methods are not very well transferable from film studies to television. So not only the students, but also those who teach television have to be aware about these differences, have to be aware how to approach television, and when it is okay to use some method that is both applicable for television and film, and when there's a need for medium specificity. So there really is a great need to approach television as television and not only as some kind of strange cousin of film. Aside from being focused on quality TV, mainly American, there's or British, there's a great deal of Americanization going on, but sometimes there's also focus on Czech quality TV. And sometimes also genre TV, especially crime TV, because that is very popular, not only among academics, but also among viewers. I included in this presentation 2 books that were written on Czech crime series. One was written by Jana Jedličková and Iveta Jancová on female protagonists in crime fiction on television, and the second one is about crime TV series made in Czech after the Velvet Revolution. So this is kind of an antidote to that Americanization, but there are still just few of them. So what are the other challenges of TV studies? Of course, there's the language barrier, because although we can discuss how it is important, especially for university students, to know other languages, especially English. As I mentioned, it's lingua franca of current era. But that doesn't mean that they can't struggle. And if the students are struggling to read English literature on their topic, they often turn to either film studies books or translated books, but there aren't that many. And sometimes they are not very adequate to their research. To give an example, there's been a translation of the book about television by Jeremy Orlobar, and while it is a great introduction to television and how to study television, it is not a great primary source for writing a thesis, but students often include it, and then when their theses are assessed, it becomes a problem. and they overuse the literature that is translated, and there is lack of diversity. So there is a need for translation and need for writing original books in Czech language. There are some for example, there's edition that is included here, through which edition the Jason Smithel book about complex television was translated and published, that is focused on popular culture and translating canonical texts from English. But of course, there's a lot of books that needs to be translated and a lot of work to be done. And since the television studies are quite new here, there's limited number of television scholars, and some of them weren't actually trained in television. They come from media studies or film studies, which is logical, but on the other hand, sometimes they can also lack some medium specificity knowledge that is needed for study of television. But it's not to say that we don't have great television scholars, but full-time television scholars are actually just a few. People who are interested in television and who teach and write about it, they actually focus also on different fields like cultural studies or media studies. And there's also need for broadening research topics from either audience or industry studies or textual analysis of certain shows, and to focus more closely on current Czech television. And that goes for papers and students' thesis as well, because while there are some interest in current television, quality television made by Czech productions, there's not much interest in other forms of current Czech television. And also there's need for studying television outside of US, so for example to focus on European television. And that, of course, comes with other challenges, because there's nothing like European television, because we have a lot of countries in Europe, a lot of landscapes, and so something like European television doesn't exist. And it's paradoxical that it's sometimes easier to access American series than European series because of geo-blocking and language barriers, copyright laws, etc. So that might be one of the reasons why students or scholars are turning to easily accessible American and British series. And I also think that there is need to shift away from either studying television industries or audiences or television texts, and to focus on broader questions. Like Julia Daci wrote in 2004, there's a need to ask question, what is happening, and link these research questions to the contexts. So to go from more specific to more broad question of television landscapes, be it Czech or otherwise. And I would like to close my paper with the notion of glamour of dissent, which Charlotte Bransden uses in her paper from 2008. And it actually considers how this outsider status of television studies can be quite useful and create kind of atmosphere for studying television, because it keeps scholars in some kind of perspective. She writes that maybe it is quite important that certain historical conditions of the existence and formation of field do not solidify into intellectual structure, an assumption about outsiderness, while studying one of the most popular leisure forms of the 20th century. So maybe what I want to propose is that we should enjoy that we are in this current situation where the television studies are only just beginning, and while foreign television studies are currently concerned with what is actually television and how to study it, and should we call it even television studies anymore? I think in the case of Czech Republic, we should yet keep the television in television studies. So that is all from me. Thank you for your attention, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Clara, for another, like the other two papers, very provocative paper, and also for challenging the kind of Anglophone norms that so often run through the field. So it's great to have your input. I'll just invite everyone who's willing and able in the audience to put your cameras on if you're okay to do that. Again, as I said at the beginning, it's kind of nice if you can for the speakers to be able to speak to faces and for us to feel like a community rather than a bunch of black boxes. So if that's possible, that would be great. Yeah, and I'll open the floor to questions and comments. You can put those in the chat, you can do the raise hand function, or if your camera's on, just wave madly at your screen and I will get there. First hand is from Michael Salmon. I'll pass to you.
Hi everyone, thanks for those lovely papers, and I think it's a provocative discussion, and my question today concerns the idea of TV and the nation. Now, TV studies often falls within conversations of the national address, speaking to a nation, or from John Ellis's seeing things, giving platform to for sort of working through national concerns. And I've become sort of hyper aware of this recently in sort of writing, involved in two projects, one about TV and heritage, and the other about sort of Netflix and in the Asia Pacific, or streaming platforms in the Asia Pacific. And in Japan in particular, Netflix as a sort of form of cultural soft power. It's being sort of included in discussions at the moment about sort of cultural imperialism and platform imperialism. It's referred to as Black Ship, which is a reference to the sort of 19th century American military sort of expedition that forced Japan to open its economy to the Western world. Anyway, I digress. So the question is, could we speak to the sort of implications of streaming on the sort of shifting role of TV, and specifically in relation to the nation? And it's an open invitation really for either any of the speakers to sort of engage with that question.
Who wants to go first on that? Rob's doing a big thinking face.
I'm doing a big thinking.
So John seems keen. I'll let Rob and Clara think. John put his hand up there.
I mean, it's instructive to go back to the moment when during the First World War, when Hollywood became the more dominant film factory in the world, and actually began to get a hold. It's never lost over movies, and we're in a similar situation now. There is a certain push towards making the big streaming companies, the global streaming companies, produce more local or regional content. They find they have to do that in harder to penetrate different cultural markets like India. They have largely abandoned China to do its own thing. So they're not quite as global as they would like to be. They do belong to this English language diaspora that Clara was talking about. So it's but it is a kind of sustained attack on what broadcasting has been, which has been largely small language, national, regional based. And we see in the UK the way that our legislators, in some way, don't really understand what's going on. So that they say, well, why do we need a license fee for public service broadcasting anymore? Because after all, everybody just gets Netflix. Well, Netflix also gives you a very narrow range, as I was saying, of traditional television genres. So we're seeing a large-scale readjustment of the market where ordinary television and live events are both being threatened with being pushed to the margins, not because people don't want them, because they continue to do that, but because the traditional structures of national broadcasting are being let go. So I think the major problem is in terms of lack of cultural awareness of the legislators who should be ensuring the continuance of national broadcasting structures, but are selling them short.
Yeah, I was thinking about this also in terms of, it feels uncomfortable to talk about like a protectionism, but it feels like an argument for a certain protectionism of public service, while acknowledging that public service and commercial imperatives can be two sides of the same coin rather than in opposition, which I think is how it often gets framed in the debates around funding and legislation. I don't know. I think Netflix, you could frame it as this kind of homogenizing, globalizing, cultural imperialist force, and it is that in many degrees. But like I think globalization always needs that steady stream of difference, whether it's different genres to constantly signal distinction and difference, or whether it's like different identities and tourist experiences of the kind that I'm talking about, where, and again, it's slightly uncomfortable because it's this idea of authentic regional representations is on the one hand objectively a good thing, but it's also being exploited for this tourist gaze that seeks to monetize it and doesn't really care what those representations mean. Just wants to kind of see that difference and kind of live in it for a bit. So it's important to defend the public service as something that you know, is polyvocal. It can speak to the nation in a very productive way, and it can also speak to the market in a way that's a bit more cynical and exploitative, but also helps those programs, you know, gain in popularity and helps develop things like European noirs, which suddenly became ways to actually get representation into rural regions and look at like move TV drama away from urban identity as the constant focus. So yeah, I think it's a push and pull as far as protecting the nation, but also acknowledging that they don't necessarily have to be protectionist as in shut the doors. Public service is something different. I think it's a flow, and legislators do need to think about how to talk about that in more nuanced terms, I think.
Talking of legislature, it actually reminded me that a while ago, the European Union informed that it want to put kind of quotas on British television. So that is kind of interesting how, for example, European Union is viewing the importance of individual nations to participate in what is European. And I think Netflix is also kind of trying to do that. Of course, as Rob was just saying, that is also a question of just want to put some kind of branding on the content. But they had great success with, for example, Dark, German series, and it helped to spread awareness of what other television landscapes look like. So it can maybe work the both ways to promote the global but also local.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Further questions, comments? Catriona, I'll go to you. Are you there?
I am here, but I'm
okay.
trying to mute myself. Sorry.
Go ahead.
Teams is not our platform of choice, I'm afraid. I just want to talk about language for a second, and the language of television studies, and whether you think the language of television studies is fit for purpose. And I'm going to draw on this from my own experience, and it's not really potentially a question at this point, but just teaching television studies over the last 2 years, I'm really struck by what students regard as television. And what they regard as being beyond television, and how they differentiate between Netflix and the BBC. And often they regard as TV as being the BBC, as being what they see on their TV, what their parents do. But then when you ask them about streaming, that's a completely different practice and a different form of engagement potentially. And I wonder then if that potentially then, that kind of separation of streaming from television perhaps speaks to some of the problems that we're seeing, for instance, within policy making. John, you kind of alluded to it in terms of some of the problems around copyright, for instance, and in the way that TV then is being regarded. And here I'm thinking about Rob in terms of how TV then is criticised or how it's engaged with as an art form and things like that. And I was just kind of wondering, we have as a field of study have grappled with the question of what is television, but I'm kind of wondering, do we need to kind of go back to that and formulate a more robust understanding of what is television?
See, I was listening to Clara speak and thinking, and I was thinking about like what she ended up concluding with the Brunsden quote about maybe it's good not to solidify into any particular framework, because that indeterminacy and that sort of frustration with always being misdefined or always being hijacked by other disciplines in some way is actually kind of what makes it fun and interesting in many ways. It's this kind of existential tension that keeps on giving and keeps like framing the way we defend television or decide what does and doesn't count. And I find it really interesting to research that, but I think you're right, it's the different ball game when it comes to teaching it, like, because you can't just dive into that with undergraduates in the same way when they have different ideas about what is streaming and what's TV. I found that they see TV, Netflix as TV, or just like as replacing TV, which I find very interesting. But you're right, it's a big conversation to then steer that around, unless that's what your module is actually about like border disputes. I don't know. Yeah, I don't think I answered the question, but I find it very interesting that way.
I think for my part,
you have to answer the question. To be honest, Rob, it's such a big question, and after 12 weeks, we didn't come to a decision about what is television. But I suppose it just made me think about the point about, are we all talking about the same thing?
Yeah.
I mean, I've been at the game of what is television since the early 1980s, and it's a question we need to kind of ask constantly. And we need to ask it both of the content. I mean, I find Kathy Johnson's distinctions in this field extremely useful. And this is what students, I think, do find very hard, is to separate out the different things. That television is at once technology, it's a form of delivery, it's a form of experience, it's kinds of content. So it's a lot of different things. And in a way, once you've sorted that out, you can then begin to say, well, television is live sport, which we don't talk about very much in television studies. It's also, cookery and home improvement programs. It is also news, so it is, and those have different demographics, different ways of being used. So to ask the question of what is television takes you immediately to the forms of delivery that you're looking at, and how specific individuals, because television is largely private, although it's a kind of common thing, it's private. You do it in private or in small groups. And it's another thing with students that they don't kind of realize, none of us really realize, how specific and individual our interactions with television actually are. And one of the great things of teaching is to be able to share those experiences, the basis of answering that question. And it is remarkable how different the same age group, a kind of what you think going into the room is a pretty homogenous group of people, will actually be in how they are using what we choose to call television, not necessarily what they choose to call television.
Clara, do you want to respond to that too?
Well, it's a really big question, right? I just think that often we are focusing too much on what is happening with television and how it is changing, how it is becoming different, how it is becoming less televisual. That we also kind of forget that real televisual things that are staying. As John Ellis mentioned, there's a lot of television genres that it is quite telling that we can't find them on Netflix, etc. So I think that yes, it is changing very much, and television can be many things at once, and that is maybe the way of looking at it, because we often want television to be one thing, but it is 10 things at once. So Netflix can be television, BBC can be television, cookery shows can be television, the tube can be television, but also your mobile phone can be television. So I think that's the way looking at it, not what we are losing, but what we are actually keeping from the old era into the new one.
Well, it's interesting, Kathy Johnson rules out YouTube because she ends up by saying that television is something about curated content rather than a chaotic heap of stuff, which is how YouTube tends to be and how it gets used as well. I'm not sure she's entirely right on that, but it's a very useful point to start.
Okay, thanks. I've got 3 hands up now. So the order they went up in was Gabrielle, then Marika, and then Matthew. So I'll go to Gabrielle first.
Thank you, everybody, for wonderful, inspiring presentations. So I wonder, is it? I mean, obviously YouTube and Netflix and Disney Plus, you know, they're drawing most of the attention of researchers, and they make us anxious because it's so difficult to keep track of what they're doing. So we are kind of desperately seeking the broadcaster in a way to echo you know, some of the canonical work, but is there the risk that technological changes are making us a bit dizzy, leading us to miss out on the fact that good old broadcast television continues to command the most attention and indeed to function as the sacred center of society when it comes to collective experiences that we can all talk about and know what we are indeed talking about? I mean, just for you know, to focus on a bit of a detail, the bar figures for the top 10 programs in 2020. The top one includes the Prime Ministerial Statement. Number 4 is an address by Her Majesty the Queen, which was viewed on television by 14.04 million. And when you combine the other 3 screens, PC, tablets, and smartphones, you only get to 14.26 million. And that pattern is recurrent across all different you know, programs. So should we? What should we do? I mean, going back to the question that was raised by Catriona, for example, is clearly the vocabulary that has informed our work continues to have as much traction as ever.
Okay, well, John, do you want to respond to that by the looks of it?
Yes, I mean, Gabrielle, that's entirely true up to a point. That the live or as live function of broadcasting continues to be very important, you know, and you pointed to some aspects of kind of national emergency and so on. There are others like the World Cup and so on. You know, there are specific live moments, but the facts are also that the audience for the television in between those big live moments is substantially smaller than it used to be in terms of ARB figures. So that's an issue. I mean, it was Elihu Katz claims that he told the Israeli when Israel was considering launching television, he said, well, we shouldn't do all this kind of 24-hour broadcasting like they do in America. You really need television just to be there when people need it, just when there are these big moments which we need a live communication mechanism with. They didn't follow his advice, but it was interesting that even back then, sort of in the early 60s, he was making that argument that there is this live function of television that really no other medium yet is able to do, and indeed streaming services can't really do either in the same way, which is why they don't do, apart from Amazon, much sport. So but that's a specific function of broadcasting. Everything in between, which used to be the kind of, we had to watch it when it was broadcast because we had no other ways of watching it, that has begun to disappear in terms of aggregate audiences. But the streaming services, if they're well designed of the broadcasters, can begin to pick up different kinds of ways of viewing that same material. And that's what the BBC is doing, because BBC iPlayer is a rather better designed one than, say, ITV Hub. So it depends a bit how individual broadcasters are adapting to the new realities of streamed content and how they make their content available to audiences, because there is you are quite right, there is a continuing need and desire for that kind of thing, and not just sort of 8-part series of American style drama.
I don't know if either of you two want to respond, or I'll move on to the next questions because I'm aware of time as well. So is that okay if I, and what I'll do is I'll Matthew, you've got your hand up, and Marika, you had your hand up earlier, but now it's gone.
I still have my hand up.
You do still have your hand up, okay. I'll take both questions together because of time, and hopefully they'll join together, but we'll see if not. Go ahead.
Okay, I actually have a question or comment for Clara, largely because I keep thinking a lot about dubbing, and because English language dubbing is traditionally not very good, it kind of has it's usually put down both in European markets and English language markets without necessarily considering the quality of it. But at the same time, as you said, translation is access, and many viewers continue to access dubbed content, and I keep wondering how central you think it is to the Czech market, and particularly to Czech television studies, and needs to be kind of considered as part of that landscape as well, where it's usually neglected in English-speaking markets because people don't dub.
Can I? Yeah, so I'll just take the other question from Matthew as well. Are you there?
Hi, sorry, I've just been hi. Oh, I think there's a delay. I've just been moderating the chat, and I just wanted to draw attention to. There's a question from Deborah, who says, "Inspiring talks, thanks. My remark is related to John's presentation. I agree that streaming services should facilitate the access to the user and archive data, and the proposed deal sounds great, but I think we could also see in this challenge the motivation to continue collaborating with computer scientists in the development of applications that can, for example, help us gather user data, etc."
Okay, thank you for that. So I'll take those in order. Clara, do you want to respond to that question about dubbing? I'll come to John.
Yes, thank you, Marike, for that question. Actually, dubbing has a great tradition in Czech Republic, and it used to be considered very good indeed, but with big saturation of the market, it is changing. There's a lot of shows to be translated, and it is of course time consuming, so the results are not as good anymore, maybe. At least that's what viewers are often complaining about. And there's a big demand for Czech dubbing or subtitles. So for example, when Netflix came to Czech Republic, there was big demand to include Czech subtitles, and the viewers are often refusing to watch something if there's not a Czech translation. And of course, it depends, because the older generations might not have such a great knowledge of foreign languages, especially English. So it depends on what the generations are you dealing with. With students, it's often not as big problem. They are often fluent in English, but there are cases when someone approaches you and say that they didn't understand something quite well, and it can create kind of barriers in what the people are then watching and what they are consuming. So it makes that very limited. And acquirement of foreign series by Czech television, for example, is also sometimes very late in the game. So they might broadcast something like 10 years after it was when it started in its original country. This creates some kind of problems of what we are actually looking at, what we are studying. But I think Netflix kind of responded for the demand, and there's also now a lot of Czech, more than before, a number of Czech films at Netflix. So that's also something that's attractive for Czech viewers.
Thank you. And then, John, I don't know if you've seen the comment in the chat. So this is about collaborating with computer scientists.
Yeah, I saw that from Deborah Castro Marino. Yes. There's a paper coming up from my colleague JP Kelly in another session who does exactly that kind of work. And yes, we do need to continue with computer scientists and increase that, but not to gather data, because we really can't do that about what people are doing on the level and the scale at which the streaming services do about their users. But what we can work with computer scientists with is to understand what they are doing with that data, how they're using it, how they're analyzing it, how it's feeding back into the requirements put on what gets commissioned, how scripts get written, what programs get renewed and how, and what changes get made, and so on. So all of those issues, the use of the data and the forms of analytics which it is put under, is really where we need to talk to computer scientists and continue with them. It's not so much about collecting data, which, I mean, there is a lot of data which is collected about, which is accessible to us about the users of the broadcast television, but the streaming system is closed off from outside data collection very deliberately.
Thanks, John. Unfortunately, we're out of time, so I'll have to end here, though I know we're going to come back to these discussions and debates throughout the next 3 weeks across the conference. Before I invite everyone to say thank you to the speakers, Elka, I was just about to say, is there anything you wanted to announce? And now you've stuck your hand up, so that's good. I was going to check if there was. Go, Elka, and then I'll come back.
Clearly. All I wanted to say is I hope that we'll be able to post this relatively soon, and if people want to continue the conversation, they could do that obviously over YouTube if you have a Google account. Alternatively, do feel free to tweet about it and maybe continue the conversation there. And I've already seen that, for example, Derek has responded to some ideas that Rob brought up earlier. So if you want to see the conversation continue, basically, these are the two media that we're using. That's it.
Okay, thank you, Alka. All right. Well, can everyone join me in thanking Rob, John and Clara for a brilliant first panel of the conference and for their fantastic papers. So thank you to all three of you. And then we all sit here looking at each other. Oh, you're muted, Elka.
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks, Brett. Thanks, Elka. That was great.
Brilliant. Thank you.
I have no idea what's going on.
I don't know. It's weird as chairing the session. I feel like I have to usher everybody out of the room.